Hi there, welcome to quiz class. I'm your quiz master, Alicia, and today I have 100 questions about the 1960s. But first, let's take a look at the quiz class awards rankings. Let us know how you do in the comments. And if you want more quizzes like this, just click the subscribe button so you don't miss out. Let's get started. By 1960, what percentage of American families owned their homes? Less than 25%, about 50%, over 50%. Over 50%. What word did British newspapers coin in 1963 to describe the frenzy surrounding the Beatles? Beat madness, Beatlemania, rock mania. Beatlemania. Which Beatles film released in 1964 dramatized the phenomenon of Beatlemania? A Hard Day's Night, Yellow Submarine, Abbey Road. A Hard Day's Night. What was the title of Elvis Presley's 1968 television special that revived his career? Blue Hawaii, Elvis the Comeback Special. Thank you very much. Elvis the Comeback Special. What was the popular evangelist known for televised revivals? Billy Graham, Norman Vincent Peale, Martin Luther. Billy Graham. What movement was gaining strength in Black churches and communities by 1960? Civil rights movement, labor movement, anti-war movement. Civil rights movement. Who gave a speech in Richmond, Virginia on New Year's Day, 1960? Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., James Baldwin. Martin Luther King Jr. What key civil rights gesture did Kennedy make in October 1960? Marching in Selma, funding protests, calling Coretta Scott King after MLK's arrest. Calling Coretta Scott King after MLK's arrest. Why were many liberals initially suspicious of Kennedy in 1960? His views and ambitions, his father's isolationism and his own weak congressional record, his Catholic faith. His father's isolationism and his own weak congressional record. In what year were the Rolling Stones formed in London? 1958, 1962, 1969. 1962. What was the Rolling Stones' first major original hit released in 1965? Paint It Black, Get Off of My Cloud, I Can't Get No Satisfaction. I Can't Get No Satisfaction. Which cultural icon publicly supported Kennedy in the 1960 campaign? Elvis Presley, Marilyn Monroe, Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra. What humiliating voting test question was asked in Mississippi? What year was the Constitution written? How many bubbles in a bar of soap? Who was the first president? How many bubbles in a bar of soap? What institution remained the strongest center of Black community life? Churches, political parties, labor unions. Churches. What biblical story was most often linked to Black freedom struggles? Exodus, Noah's Ark, David and Goliath. Exodus. What new group was formed to lead the Montgomery bus boycott? Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA. What was Nixon's madman theory intended to convince North Vietnam of? That he was withdrawing immediately, that he might do anything, even use nuclear weapons, that he wanted peace. That he might do anything, even use nuclear weapons. Where did the first sit-in movement begin in 1960? Atlanta, Georgia, Greensboro, North Carolina, Montgomery, Alabama. Greensboro, North Carolina. Which American animated television sitcom aired on ABC on September 30, 1960? Family Guy, The Flintstones, The Simpsons. The Flintstones. What was the purpose of the 1961 Freedom Ride? To desegregate city buses, to test Supreme Court rulings on bus terminal segregation, to protest segregated schools. To test Supreme Court rulings on bus terminal segregation. Who was badly beaten in jail? Badly beaten by jail guards in Winona, Mississippi in 1963? Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker. Fannie Lou Hamer. At which 1969 concert did the murder of Meredith Hunter by Hells Angels security mark a dark moment in rock history? Woodstock Festival, Altamont Speedway, Isle of Wight Festival. Altamont Speedway. How many American troops were withdrawn from Vietnam in 1969? About 65,000, about 100,000, about 20,000. About 65,000. Which northern city was highlighted as an example of continuing segregation despite progressive rhetoric? Harlem, New York, Detroit, Michigan, Cleveland, Ohio. Harlem, New York. What Broadway play by Lorraine Hansberry depicted the struggles of Black families in Chicago? Porgy and Bess, A Raisin in the Sun, Fences. A Raisin in the Sun. What was Joseph P. Kennedy Sr.'s lifelong ambition that he never achieved? To become a senator, to become mayor of New York, to become the president. To become the president. What major civil rights action did Rodney Powell support in the early 1960s? The Freedom Rides and Woolworth sit-ins, March on Washington, Voting Rights Act. The Freedom Rides and Woolworth sit-ins. Why was defining the foe of civil rights harder in the North than in the South? Northern laws already banned segregation. Blacks had equal political power. The North had no racism. Northern laws already banned segregation. According to American civil rights activist James Baldwin, how could a ghetto be improved? By better housing programs, by eliminating it all entirely, by electing more leaders. By eliminating it entirely. What did Black nationalists argue was more important than integration? Access to jobs, housing, and commodities, voting rights, college education. Access to jobs, housing, and commodities. Which religious movement promoted Black self-reliance and rejection of white culture in the 1950s to 1960s? NAACP, Nation of Islam, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Nation of Islam. Who founded the Nation of Islam organization? Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad, Wali Farad. Wali Farad. What personal changes did the Nation of Islam encourage? Keeping slave names, renouncing alcohol and adopting new names, voting Republican. Renouncing alcohol and adopting new names. When did the Apollo 11 land on the moon? July 20, 1969, July 20, 1967, December 20, 1969. July 20, 1969. What are the names of the crew members of the Apollo 11? Neil Armstrong, Edwin Aldrin, and James Irwin. Neil Armstrong, Edwin Aldrin, and Alan Shepard. Neil Armstrong, Edwin Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Neil Armstrong, Edwin Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Who did Malcolm X convert to the Nation of Islam in 1963 to 1964? Martin Luther King Jr., Cassius Clay Muhammad Ali, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Cassius Clay Muhammad Ali. Which group dismissed liberal reformers as eggheads? Civil rights activists, old-line Democratic politicians, Reform Democrats. Old-line Democratic politicians. What was George Meany's role in the labor movement? Head of the AFL-CIO, leader of the Teamsters, senator from Arkansas. Head of the AFL-CIO. Jimmy Hoffa was associated with which union? United Auto Workers, Teamsters Union, AFL-CIO. Teamsters Union. Who was the aggressive chief counsel in the Valachi-McClellan hearings? George Meany, Robert Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson. Robert Kennedy. The four freedoms articulated by Roosevelt included all except freedom of speech, freedom from want, freedom to bear arms. Freedom to bear arms. Which landmark act did Nixon later endorse in 1965? Equal Pay Act, Equal Employment Act, Civil Rights Act. Equal Pay Act. The term affirmative action was first used under which presidential administration? Nixon, Johnson, Kennedy. Johnson. John F. Kennedy's first book was titled Profiles in Courage, Why England Slept, Unsafe at Any Speed. Why England Slept. Kennedy's war hero reputation came from his command of which vessel? Submarine, PT boat, aircraft carrier. PT boat. Which magazine publicized Kennedy's PT 109 story? Reader's Digest, Life, The New Republic. Reader's Digest. The term gay pride first emerged after which 1969 event? Selma March, Stonewall Rebellion, March on Washington. Stonewall Rebellion. What did Pope Paul VI declare in Humanae Vitae 1968? Contraceptives of any kind were banned, abortion was acceptable, Catholics could freely use birth control. Contraceptives of any kind were banned. What percentage of black voters supported Kennedy in 1960? 50%, 10%, 70%. 70%. What practice did the Zen Center in San Francisco emphasize? Zazen meditation, singing hymns, Chinese healing. Zazen meditation. Which Beatle was most associated with Indian gurus and the sitar? Paul McCartney, George Harrison, John Lennon. George Harrison. Kennedy's inaugural address emphasized domestic reform, foreign policy and Cold War commitment, labor rights. Foreign policy and Cold War commitment. How did the U.S. learn about new military construction and the presence of Soviet technicians in Cuba? On-ground informants, U-2 spy planes, U.S. allies. U-2 spy planes. Who did Kennedy outflank on foreign policy in the 1960 election? Richard Nixon, Dwight Eisenhower, Barry Goldwater. Richard Nixon. What was the ironic nickname given to Kennedy's foreign policy advisors? The Wise Owls, the Best and the Brightest, the Cold Warriors. The Best and the Brightest. What was unique about the 60s religious Reformation compared to earlier revivals? It was entirely political. It expanded beyond Judeo-Christian traditions into Asian religious spiritualism. It focused solely on Christianity. It expanded beyond Judeo-Christian traditions into Asian religious and spiritualism. What major commitment did Kennedy make regarding space? Land a satellite on Mars, send a man to the moon by the end of the decade, build the largest space station. Send a man to the moon by the end of the decade. What was the name of the failed invasion of Cuba in 1961? Operation Mongoose, Bay of Pigs, Operation Overlord. Bay of Pigs. What was the purpose of Operation Mongoose? Train astronauts, overthrow Castro's regime, strengthen NATO. Overthrow Castro's regime. Who led the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Joseph Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev. Nikita Khrushchev. How did Kennedy respond to Soviet missiles in Cuba? Full invasion, naval quarantine, airstrikes. Naval quarantine. What agreement helped end the Cuban Missile Crisis? U.S. would never intervene in Vietnam. U.S. would not invade Cuba and remove missiles from Turkey. USSR would leave Berlin. U.S. would not invade Cuba and remove missiles from Turkey. What communication link was created after the Cuban Missile Crisis? NATO Hotline, Moscow-Washington Hotline, Pentagon Red Line. Moscow-Washington Hotline. Which act provided loans to businesses in depressed regions like Appalachia? Manpower Development Act, Area Redevelopment Act, New Deal Act. Area Redevelopment Act. What major economic policy did Kennedy propose in 1963? $10 billion tax cut, $5 billion defense cut, national sales tax. $10 billion tax cut. What commission on women did Kennedy establish in 1961? Equal Rights Commission, Women's Leadership Board, President's Commission on the Status of Women. President's Commission on the Status of Women. What domestic issue was most politically problematic for Kennedy? Civil rights, space program, healthcare. Civil rights. Kennedy's liberalism in domestic policy became more evident in which year? 1960, 1958, 1963. 1963. What was the Vietnam War's distinction in U.S. history? Shortest war fought by the U.S., longest war fought by the U.S., first war fought outside the Western Hemisphere. Longest war fought by the U.S. About how many Americans died in the Vietnam War? 58,000 plus, 22,000, 100,000 plus. 58,000 plus. What was the main American justification for fighting in Vietnam? territorial expansion, protecting U.S. credibility, access to natural resources. Protecting U.S. credibility. Which two American presidencies were deeply affected by the Vietnam War? Eisenhower and Kennedy, Johnson and Nixon, Truman and Carter. Johnson and Nixon. Vietnam is geographically comparable in size to which U.S. state? Texas, New Mexico, California. New Mexico. Which two rivers form fertile deltas in Vietnam? Mekong and Red, Volga and Yellow, Yangtze and Ganges. Mekong and Red. What were Fidel Castro's views on how the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved? He agreed with the U.S. He agreed with the Soviet strategy. He was infuriated by the Soviets' retreat. He was infuriated by the Soviets' retreat. What phrase does Ho Chi Minh translate to in English? The Patriot, he who enlightens, great leader. He who enlightens. What were cursillos? Catholic schools for children, a type of Catholic hymn, little courses where Mexican-American laymen studied scripture. Little courses where Mexican-American laymen studied scripture. What term did Americans often use to describe the National Liberation Front, NLF? Viet Minh, Viet Cong, VC, Red Army. Viet Cong, VC. What was the Ho Chi Minh Trail primarily used for? Trade and farming, transporting North Vietnamese soldiers and supplies, American evacuation routes. Transporting North Vietnamese soldiers and supplies. What percentage of Americans were unsure how the country could carry on without Kennedy? 70%, 50%, 30%. 70%. Where was President Kennedy assassinated? Texas, California, New York. Texas. Who did some liberals consider nominating instead of Johnson in 1964? Hubert Humphrey, Robert Kennedy, Adlai Stevenson. Robert Kennedy. Johnson's father served in which political body? U.S. Senate, Texas State Legislature, U.S. House. Texas State Legislature. Who brought Transcendental Meditation, TM, to the U.S.? Oscar Ichazo, Richard Rodriguez, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Who gave a major anti-Vietnam War speech in New York City in April 1967? Robert McNamara, Martin Luther King Jr., Lyndon B. Johnson. Martin Luther King, Jr. What national organization grew out of local welfare rights groups in the mid-1960s? National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, National Welfare Rights Organization, NWRO, Congress of Racial Equity, CORE. National Welfare Rights Organization, NWRO. Who was Nixon's closest foreign policy advisor during his presidency? Robert McNamara, William Rogers, Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger. What policy did Nixon announce in 1969 to gradually shift the fighting to South Vietnam's army? Marshall Plan, Vietnamization, Peace with Honor. Vietnamization. What phrase did Nixon use to describe anti-war protesters? Unpatriotic radicals, an effete core of impudent snobs, peace at any price crowd. An effete core of impudent snobs. How did Kennedy describe Johnson's presence at cabinet meetings? Too talkative, too cheerful, too sad. Too sad. What book by Kevin Phillips influenced Nixon's Southern strategy? The Emerging Republican Majority, The Conscience of a Conservative, Silent Spring. The Emerging Republican Majority. The Civil Rights Act was signed into law in which year? 1959, 1964, 1969. 1964. The Civil Rights Act also banned discrimination based on what besides race? Religion, gender, age. Gender. Lyndon Johnson promised to keep the federal budget under what amount after the tax cut? $100 billion, $250 billion, $15 billion. $100 billion. Which book influenced Kennedy's concern about poverty? The Affluent Society, The Other America, Silent Spring. The Other America. Who wrote The Other America? Arthur Schlesinger, Michael Harrington, John Kenneth Galbraith. Michael Harrington. Johnson declared a war on poverty in which year? 1960, 1962, 1964. 1964. What massive anti-war event took place on October 15, 1969? The Vietnam Moratorium, the March on the Pentagon, the Poor People's Campaign. The Vietnam Moratorium. Where was John F. Kennedy born? Brookline, Massachusetts, Boston, Massachusetts, Providence, Rhode Island. Brookline, Massachusetts. Last question. What campaign slogan captured Kennedy's promise of energy and change? Time for change. Get the nation moving again. Build a better America. Get the nation moving again. And that's the last one. Bonus question. What is the name of Frank Zappa's first album release? Let us know in the comments. So how'd you do? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget, if you want more quizzes like this, click the subscribe button. Thanks for playing.